Then the booking clerk looked out, said it was really high time, took the banknote, and slammed down on the counter the ticket he had been asked for and the change. Now Rabin tried to count his change quickly, thinking he ought to be getting more, but a porter who was walking nearby hurried him through a glass door onto the platform. There Rabin looked around, while calling out, thank you, to the porter, and since he found no guard, he climbed up the steps of the nearest coach by himself, each time putting the suitcase on the step above and then following himself, supporting himself on his umbrella with one hand, and on the handle of the suitcase with the other. The coach that he entered was brightly illuminated by the great amount of light from the main hall of the station, in which it was standing, in front of many a windowpane. All were shut right up to the top, a hissing arc lamp hung at about eye level, and the many raindrops on the glass were white, often single ones would move. Rabin could hear the noise from the platform even when he had shut the carriage door and sat down on the last little free bit of a light brown wooden seat. He saw many people's backs, and the backs of their heads, and between them the upturned faces of people on the seat opposite. In some places smoke was curling from pipes and cigars, in one place drifting limply past the face of a girl. Often the passengers would change places, discussing these changes with each other, or they would transfer their luggage, which lay in a narrow blue net over a seat, to another one. If a stick or the metal-covered corner of a suitcase stuck out, then the owner would have his attention drawn to this. He would go over and straighten it. Rabin also bethought himself and pushed his suitcase under his seat. On his left, at the window, two gentlemen were sitting opposite each other, talking about the price of goods. They're commercial travelers, Rabin thought, and, breathing regularly, he gazed at them. The merchant sends them into the country, they obey, they travel by train, and in every village they go from shop to shop. Sometimes they travel by carriage between the villages. They must not stay long anywhere, for everything must be done fast, and they must always talk only about their goods. With what pleasure, then, one can exert oneself in an occupation that is so agreeable. The younger man had jerked a notebook out of the hip pocket of his trousers, rapidly flicked the leaves over with a forefinger moistened on his tongue, and then read through a page, drawing the back of his fingernail down it as he went. He looked at Rabin as he glanced up and, indeed, when he now began talking about thread prices, did not turn his face away from Rabin, as one gazes steadily at a point in order not to forget anything of what one wants to say. At the same time he drew his brows tightly down over his eyes. He held the half-closed notebook in his left hand, with his thumb on the page he had been reading, in order to be able to refer to it easily if he should need to. And the notebook trembled, for he was not supporting his arm on anything, and the coach, which was now in motion, beat on the rails like a hammer. The other traveler sat leaning back, listening and nodding at regular intervals. It was evident that he was far from agreeing with everything and later would give his own opinion. Rabin laid his curved hands palm down on his knees and, leaning forward, between the travelers' heads he saw the window and through the window lights flitting past and others flitting away into the distance. He did not understand anything of what the traveler was talking about, nor would he understand the other's answer. Much preparation would first be required, for here were people who had been concerned with goods since their youth. But if one has held a spool of thread in one's hand so often and handed it to one's customer so often, then one knows the price and can talk about it, while villages come toward us and flash past, while at the same time they turn away into the depths of the country, where first they must disappear. And yet these villages are inhabited, and there perhaps travelers go from shop to shop. In a corner at the far end of the coach a tall man stood up, holding playing cards in his hand, and called out, "I say, Marie, did you pack the Zephyr shirts?" "Of course I did," said the woman, who was sitting opposite Rabin. She had been dozing, and now when the question waked her she answered as though she were talking to herself or to Rabin. "You're going to market at Jungbunzlau, the vivacious traveler asked her. "Jungbunzlau, that's right. It's a big market this time, isn't it?" "A big market, that's right." She was sleepy, she rested her left elbow on a blue bundle, and her head dropped heavily against her hand, which pressed through the flesh of the cheek to the cheekbone. "How young she is," the traveler said. Rabin took the money that he had received from the cashier out of his waistcoat pocket and counted it over. He held up each coin firmly between thumb and forefinger for a long time and also twisted it this way and that on the inner surface of his thumb with the tip of his forefinger. He looked for a long time at the emperor's image, then he was struck by the laurel wreath and the way it was fastened with knots and bows of ribbon at the back of the head. At last he found the sum was correct and put the money into a big black purse. But now when he was about to say to the traveler, "They're a married couple, don't you think?" the train stopped. The noise of the journey ceased, guards shouted the name of a place, and Rabin said nothing. The train started again so slowly that one could picture the revolutions of the wheels, but a moment later it was racing down a slope, and all unexpectedly the tall railings of a bridge, outside the windows, were torn apart and pressed together, as it seemed. Rabin was now pleased that the train was going so fast, for he would not have wanted to stay in the last place. When it is dark there, when one knows no one there, when it is such a long way home. But then it must be terrible there by day. And is it different at the next station or at the previous ones or at the later ones or at the village I am going to? The traveler was suddenly talking more loudly. "It's a long way yet," Rabin thought. "Sir, you know just as well as I do, these manufacturers send their travelers around the most godforsaken little villages. They go crawling to the seediest of little shopkeepers, and do you think they offer them prices different from those they offer us big businessmen? Sir, take it from me. Exactly the same prices, only yesterday I saw it black on white. I call it villainy. They're squeezing us out of existence. Under current conditions it's simply impossible for us to do business. Again he looked at Rabin. He was not ashamed of the tears in his eyes. He pressed the knuckles of his left hand to his mouth because his lips were quivering. Rabin leaned back and tugged faintly at his mustache with his left hand. The shopwoman opposite woke up and smilingly passed her hands over her forehead. The traveler talked more quietly. Once again the woman shifted as though settling down to sleep, half lying on her bundle, and sighed. The skirt was drawn tight over her right hip. Behind her sat a gentleman with a traveling cap on his head, reading a large newspaper. The girl opposite him, who was probably a relative of his, urged him, at the same time inclining her head toward her right shoulder, to open the window, because it was so very hot. He said, without looking up, he would do it in a moment, only he must first finish reading an article in the newspaper, and he showed her which article he meant. The shopwoman could not go to sleep again. She sat upright and looked out of the window, then for a long time she looked at the oil lamp and the flame burning yellow near the ceiling of the carriage. Rabin shut his eyes for a little while. When he glanced up, the shopwoman was just biting into a piece of cake that was spread with brown jam. The bundle next to her was open. The traveler was smoking a cigar in silence and kept on fidgeting as though he were tapping the ash off the end of it. The other was poking about in the works of a pocket watch with the tip of a knife, so that one could hear it scraping. With his eyes almost shut, Rabin still had time to see, in a blurred way, the gentleman in the traveling cap pulling at the window strap. There came a gust of cool air, and a straw hat fell from a hook. Rabin thought he was waking up and that was why his cheeks were so refreshed, or someone was opening the door and drawing him into the room, or he was in some way mistaken about things, and, breathing deeply, he quickly fell asleep. 2. The steps of the coach were still shaking a little when Rabin climbed down them. Into his face, coming out of the air of the carriage, the rain beat, and he shut his eyes. It was raining noisily on the corrugated iron roof of the station building, but out in the open country the rain fell in such a way that it sounded like the uninterrupted blowing of the wind. A barefoot boy came running up. Rabin did not see from where, and breathlessly asked Rabin to let him carry the suitcase, for it was raining. But Rabin said, yes, it was raining, and he would therefore go by omnibus. He did not need him, he said. Thereupon the boy pulled a face as though he thought it grander to walk in the rain and have one's suitcase carried than to go by bus, and instantly turned around and ran away. When Rabin wanted to call him, it was already too late. There were 2 lighted lamps, and a station official came out of a door. Without hesitation he walked through the rain to the engine, stood there motionless with his arms folded, and waited until the engine driver leaned over his rail and talked to him. A porter was called, came, and was sent back again. At many of the windows in the train there were passengers standing, and since what they had to look at was an ordinary railway station their gaze was probably dim, the eyelids closed together, as though the train were in motion. A girl came hurrying along from the road to the platform under a parasol with a flowered pattern. She set the open parasol on the ground and sat down, pushing her legs apart so that her skirt should dry better, and ran her fingertips over the tight stretched skirt. There were only 2 lamps alight, her face was indistinguishable. The porter came past and complained that puddles were forming under the parasol. He held his arms in a semicircle before him in order to demonstrate the size of these puddles, and then moved his hands through the air, one after the other, like fishes sinking into deeper water, in order to make it clear that traffic was also being impeded by this parasol. The train started, disappeared like a long sliding door, and behind the poplars on the far side of the railway track there was the landscape, so massive that it took away one's breath. Was it a dark view through a gap, or was it woods? Was it a pool, or a house in which the people were already asleep? Was it a church steeple or a ravine between the hills? Nobody must dare to go there, but who could restrain himself? And when Rabin caught sight of the official, he was already at the step up to his office. He ran in front of him and stopped him. Excuse me, please, is it far to the village? That's where I want to go. No, a quarter of an hour, but by bus. As it's raining, you'll be there in 5 minutes. It's raining. It's not a very fine spring, Rabin said. The official had put his right hand on his hip, and through the triangle formed by the arm and the body Rabin saw the girl, who had now shut the parasol, on the seat where she sat. If one is going on one's summer holidays now and is going to stay there, one can't but regret it. Actually, I thought I should be met. He glanced around to make it seem plausible. You will miss the bus, I'm afraid. It doesn't wait so long. Nothing to thank me for. That's the road, between the hedges. The road outside the railway station was not lighted. Only from 3 ground floor windows in the building there came a misty glimmer, but it did not extend far. Rabin walked on tiptoe through the mud and shouted, driver, and, hello there, and, omnibus, and, here I am, many times. But when he landed among scarcely interrupted puddles on the dark side of the road, he had to tramp onwards with his heels down, until suddenly a horse's moist muzzle touched his forehead. There was the omnibus. He quickly climbed into the empty compartment, sat down by the windowpane behind the driver's box, and hunched his back into the corner, for he had done all that was necessary. For if the driver is asleep, he will wake up toward morning. If he is dead, then a new driver will come, or the innkeeper, and should that not happen either, then passengers will come by the early morning train, people in a hurry, making a noise. In any case, one can be quiet. One may even draw the curtains over the windows and wait for the jerk with which the vehicle must start. Yes, after all I have already accomplished, it is certain that tomorrow I shall get to Betty and to Mama. Nobody can prevent that. Yet it is true, and was indeed to be foreseen, that my letter will arrive only tomorrow, so that I might very well have remained in town and spent an agreeable night at Elvie's, without having to be afraid of the next day's work, the sort of thing that otherwise ruins every pleasure for me. But look, I've got my feet wet. He lit a stub of candle that he had taken out of his waistcoat pocket and set it on the seat opposite. It was bright enough. The darkness outside made it appear as though the omnibus had black distempered walls and no glass in the windows. There was no need to think that there were wheels under the floor and in front the horse between the shafts. Rabin rubbed his feet thoroughly on the seat, pulled on clean socks, and sat up straight. Then he heard someone from the station shouting, "Hi," if there was anyone in the bus he might say so. Yes, and he would like to start now, too, Rabin answered, leaning out of the door, which he had opened, holding on to the doorpost with his right hand, the left hand held open, close to his mouth. The rain gushed down the back of his neck, inside his collar. Wrapped in the canvas of 2 sacks that had been cut up, the driver came over, the reflection of his stable lantern jumping through the puddles at his feet. Irritably he began an explanation. "Listen here," he said, he had been playing cards with Lebeda and they had just been getting on fine when the train came. It would really have been impossible for him to take a look outside then. Still, he did not mean to abuse anyone who did not understand that. Apart from that, this place here was a filthy dump, and no half measures, and it was hard to see what business a gentleman like this could have here, and he would be getting there soon enough anyway, so that he need not go and complain anywhere. Only just now Herr Brickershofer, if you please, that's the junior assistant clerk, had come in and had said he thought a small fair man had been wanting to go by the omnibus. Well, so he had at once come and asked, or hadn't he at once come and asked? The lantern was attached to the end of the shaft. The horse, having been shouted at in a muffled voice, began to pull, and the water on top of the bus, now set stirring, dripped slowly through a crack into the carriage. The road was perhaps hilly. There was surely mud flying up into the spokes. Fans of puddle water formed, with a rushing sound, behind the turning wheels. It was for the most part with loose reins that the driver guided the dripping horse. Could not all this be used as reproaches against Rabin? Many puddles were unexpectedly lit up by the lantern trembling on the shaft, and split up, in ripples, under the wheel. This happened solely because Rabin was traveling to his fiancée, to Betty, an oldish pretty girl. And who, if one were going to speak of it at all, would appreciate what merits Rabin here had, even if it was only that he bore those reproaches, which admittedly nobody could make openly. Of course he was doing it gladly. Betty was his fiancée, he was fond of her, it would be disgusting if she were to thank him for that as well, but all the same. Without meaning to, he often bumped his head on the panel against which he was leaning, then for a while he looked up at the ceiling. Once his right hand slipped down from his thigh, where he had been resting it. But his elbow remained in the angle between belly and leg. The omnibus was now traveling between houses. Here and there the inside of the coach had a share of the light from a room. There were some steps. To see the first of them Rabin would have had to stand up, built up to a church. Outside a park gate there was a lamp with a large flame burning in it, but a statue of a saint stood out in black relief only because of the light from a draper's shop. And Rabin saw his candle, which had burnt down, the trickle of wax hanging motionless from the seat. When the bus stopped outside the inn, and the rain could be heard loudly and, probably there was a window open, so could the voices of the guests, Rabin wondered which would be better, to get out at once or to wait until the innkeeper came to the coach. What the custom was in this township he did not know, but it was pretty certain that Betty would have spoken of her fiancé, and according to whether his arrival here was magnificent or feeble, so the esteem in which she was held here would increase or diminish, and with that, again, his own, too. But of course he knew neither what people felt about her nor what she had told them about him, and so everything was all the more disagreeable and difficult. Oh, beautiful city and beautiful the way home. If it rains there, one goes home by tram over wet cobbles. Here one goes in a cart through mud to an inn. The city is far from here, and if I were now in danger of dying of homesickness, nobody could get me back there today. Well, anyway, I shouldn't die, but there I get the meal expected for that evening, set on the table, on the right behind my plate the newspaper, on the left the lamp. Here I shall be given some dreadfully fat dish. They don't know that I have a weak stomach, and even if they did know, an unfamiliar newspaper. Many people, whom I can already hear, will be there, and one lamp will be lit for all. What sort of light can it provide? Enough to play cards by, but for reading a newspaper? The innkeeper isn't coming, he's not interested in guests, he is probably an unfriendly man. Or does he know that I am Betty's fiancé, and does that give him a reason for not coming to fetch me in? It would be in accord with that the driver kept me waiting so long at the station. Betty has often told me, after all, how much she has been bothered by lecherous men and how she has had to rebuff their insistence. Perhaps it is that here too. Text breaks off. Second manuscript. When Eduard Rabin, coming along the passage, walked into the open doorway, he could now see how it was raining. It was not raining much. On the pavement straight in front of him, not higher, not lower, there were, in spite of the rain, many passers-by. Every now and again one would step forward and cross the road. A little girl was carrying a gray dog on her outstretched arms. Two gentlemen were exchanging information on some subject, at times turning the whole front of their bodies to each other, and then slowly turning aside themselves again. It was like doors ajar in the wind. The one held his hands palm upward, raising and lowering them in regular motion, as though he were balancing a load, testing the weight of it. Then one caught sight of a slim lady whose face twitched slightly, like the flickering light of the stars, and whose flat hat was loaded high and to the brim with unrecognizable objects. She appeared to be a stranger to all the passers-by, without intending it, as though by some law. And hurrying past was a young man with a thin walking stick, his left hand, as though paralyzed, lying flat on his chest. Many were out on business. In spite of the fact that they walked fast, one saw them longer than others, now on the pavement, now below. Their coats fitted them badly. They did not care how they carried themselves. They let themselves be pushed by the people and they pushed too. Three gentlemen, two holding lightweight overcoats on their crooked forearms, walked from the front of the building to the edge of the pavement, in order to see what was going on in the carriageway and on the farther pavement. Through the gaps between the passers-by, now fleetingly, then comfortably, one saw the regularly set cobbles in the carriageway, on which carriages, swaying on their wheels, were swiftly drawn by horses with arched necks. The people who sat at ease on the upholstered seats gazed in silence at the pedestrians, the shops, the balconies, and the sky. If it happened that one carriage overtook another, then the horses would press against each other, and the harness straps hung dangling. The animals tugged at the shafts, the carriage bowled along, swaying as it gathered speed, until the swerve around the carriage ahead was completed and the horses moved apart again, still with their narrow heads inclined toward each other. An elderly gentleman came quickly toward the front entrance, stopped on the dry mosaic paving, turned around. And he then gazed into the rain, which, wedged in by the narrow street, fell confusedly. Rabin put down the suitcase with the black cloth cover, bending his right knee a little in doing so. The rainwater was already running along the edge of the carriageway in streaks that almost extended to the lower-lying gutters. The elderly gentleman stood upright near Rabin, who was supporting himself by leaning slightly against the wooden doorpost. From time to time he glanced toward Rabin, even though to do so he had to twist his neck sharply. Yet he did this only out of the natural desire, now that he happened to be unoccupied, to observe everything exactly, at least in his vicinity. The result of this aimless glancing hither and thither was that there was a great deal he did not notice. So, for instance, it escaped him that Rabin's lips were very pale, not much less so than the very faded red of his tie, which had a once striking Moorish pattern. Now, had he noticed this, he would certainly have made a fuss about it, at least inwardly, which, again, would not have been the right thing, for Rabin was always pale, even if, it was a fact, various things might have been making him especially tired just recently. What weather? The gentleman said in a low voice, shaking his head, consciously, it was true, but still in a slightly senile way. Yes, indeed, and when one's supposed to be starting on a journey, too, Rabin said, quickly straightening up. And it isn't the kind of weather that will improve, the gentleman said and, in order to make sure of it once more for the last time, bent forward to glance in scrutiny up the street, then down, and then at the sky. It may last for days, even for weeks. So far as I recall, nothing better is forecast for June and the beginning of July, either. Well, it's no pleasure to anyone. I for instance shall have to do without my walks, which are extremely important to my health. Hereupon he yawned and seemed to become exhausted, since he had now heard Rabin's voice and, occupied with this conversation, no longer took any interest in anything, not even in the conversation. This made quite an impression on Rabin, since after all the gentleman had addressed him first, and he therefore tried to show off a little, although it might not even be noticed. True, he said, in town one can very easily manage to go without what isn't good for one. If one does not do without it, then one has only oneself to blame for the bad consequences. One will be sorry and in this way come to see for the first time really clearly how to manage the next time. And even if in matters of detail, 2 pages missing, I don't mean anything by it. I don't mean anything at all, Rabin hastened to say, prepared to excuse the gentleman's absent-mindedness in any way possible, since after all he wanted to show off a little more. It's all just out of the book previously mentioned, which I, like other people, happen to have been reading in the evening recently. I have been mostly alone. Owing to family circumstances, you see. But apart from anything else, a good book is what I like best after supper. Always has been. Just recently I read in a prospectus a quotation from some writer or other. A good book is the best friend there is, and that's really true, it is so, a good book is the best friend there is. Yes, when one is young, the gentleman said, meaning nothing in particular by this, merely wanting to indicate how it was raining, that the rain was heavier again, and that now it was not going to stop at all. But to Rabin it sounded as though at 60 the gentleman still thought of himself as young and energetic and considered Rabin's 30 years nothing in comparison, and as though he meant to say besides, insofar as it was permissible, that at the age of 30 he had, of course, been more sensible than Rabin. And that he believed even if one had nothing else to do, like himself, for instance, an old man, yet it was really wasting one's time to stand about here in this hall, looking at the rain, but if one spent the time, Besides, in chatter, one was wasting it doubly. Now Rabin had believed for some time that nothing other people said about his capabilities or opinions had been able to affect him, on the contrary, that he had positively abandoned the position where he had listened, all submissively, to everything that was said, so that people were now simply wasting their breath whether they happened to be against him or for him. And so he said, "We are talking about different things, since you did not wait to hear what I was going to say." Please go on, the gentleman said. Well, it isn't so important, Rabin said. I was only going to say books are useful in every sense and quite especially in respects in which one would not expect it. For when one is about to embark on some enterprise, it is precisely the books whose contents have nothing at all in common with the enterprise that are the most useful. For the reader who does after all intend to embark on that enterprise, that is to say, who has somehow become enthusiastic, and even if, as it were, the effect of the book can penetrate only so far as that enthusiasm will be stimulated by the book to all kinds of thoughts concerning his enterprise. Now, however, since the contents of the book are precisely something of utter indifference, the reader is not at all impeded in those thoughts, and he passes through the midst of the book with them, as once the Jews passed through the Red Sea. That's how I should like to put it. For Rabin, the whole person of the old gentleman now assumed an unpleasant expression. It seemed to him as though he had drawn particularly close to him, but it was merely trifling. 2 pages missing. The newspaper, too. But I was about to say, I am only going into the country, that's all, only for a fortnight. I am taking a holiday for the first time for quite a long period, and it's necessary for other reasons too, and yet for instance a book that I was, as I have mentioned, reading recently taught me more about my little journey than you could imagine. I am listening, the gentleman said. Rabin was silent and, standing there so straight, put his hands into his overcoat pockets, which were rather too high. Only after a while did the old gentleman say, "This journey seems to be of some special importance to you." Well, you see, Rabin said, once more supporting himself against the doorpost. Only now did he see how the passage had filled up with people. They were standing even around the foot of the staircase, and an official, who had rented a room in the apartment of the same woman as Rabin had, when he came down the stairs had to ask the people to make way for him. To Rabin, who only pointed at the rain, he called out over several heads, which now all turned to Rabin, "Have a good journey," and reiterated a promise, obviously given earlier, definitely to visit Rabin the next Sunday. 2 pages missing. Has a pleasant job, with which he is indeed satisfied and which has always been kept open for him. He has such powers of endurance and is inwardly so gay that he does not need anyone to keep him entertained, but everyone needs him. He has always been healthy. Oh, don't try to tell me. I am not going to argue, the gentleman said. You won't argue, but you won't admit your mistake either. Why do you stick to it so? And however sharply you may recollect now, you would, I dare wager, forget everything if you were to talk to him. You would reproach me for not having refuted you more effectively now. If he so much as talks about a book, he's instantly ecstatic about everything beautiful. Translated by Ernst Kaiser and Ethna Wilkins. The Judgment. It was a Sunday morning in the very height of spring. Georg Bendemann, a young merchant, was sitting in his own room on the first floor of one of a long row of small, ramshackle houses stretching beside the river which were scarcely distinguishable from each other in height and coloring. He had just finished a letter to an old friend of his who was now living abroad, had put it into its envelope in a slow and dreamy fashion, and with his elbows propped on the writing table was gazing out of the window at the river, the bridge, and the hills on the farther bank with their tender green. He was thinking about his friend, who had actually run away to Russia some years before, being dissatisfied with his prospects at home. Now he was carrying on a business in St. Petersburg, which had flourished to begin with but had long been going downhill, as he always complained on his increasingly rare visits. So he was wearing himself out to no purpose in a foreign country. The unfamiliar full beard he wore did not quite conceal the face Georg had known so well since childhood, and his skin was growing so yellow as to indicate some latent disease. By his own account he had no regular connection with the colony of his fellow countrymen out there and almost no social intercourse with Russian families, so that he was resigning himself to becoming a permanent bachelor. What could one write to such a man, who had obviously run off the rails, a man one could be sorry for but could not help? Should one advise him to come home, to transplant himself and take up his old friendships again? There was nothing to hinder him, and in general to rely on the help of his friends? But that was as good as telling him, and the more kindly the more offensively, that all his efforts hitherto had miscarried, that he should finally give up, come back home, and be gaped at by everyone as a returned prodigal, that only his friends knew what was what and that he himself was just a big child who should do what his successful and home-keeping friends prescribed. And was it certain, besides, that all the pain one would have to inflict on him would achieve its object? Perhaps it would not even be possible to get him to come home at all. He said himself that he was now out of touch with commerce in his native country, and then he would still be left an alien in a foreign land embittered by his friends' advice and more than ever estranged from them. But if he did follow their advice and then didn't fit in at home, not out of malice, of course, but through force of circumstances, couldn't get on with his friends or without them, felt humiliated, couldn't be said to have either friends or a country of his own any longer, wouldn't it have been better for him to stay abroad just as he was? Taking all this into account, how could one be sure that he would make a success of life at home? For such reasons, supposing one wanted to keep up correspondence with him, one could not send him any real news such as could frankly be told to the most distant acquaintance. It was more than 3 years since his last visit, and for this he offered the lame excuse that the political situation in Russia was too uncertain, which apparently would not permit even the briefest absence of a small businessman while it allowed hundreds of thousands of Russians to travel peacefully abroad. But during these 3 years Georg's own position in life had changed a lot. 2 years ago his mother had died, since when he and his father had shared the household together, and his friend had of course been informed of that and had expressed his sympathy in a letter phrased so dryly that the grief caused by such an event, one had to conclude, could not be realized in a distant country. Since that time, however, Georg had applied himself with greater determination to the business as well as to everything else. Perhaps during his mother's lifetime his father's insistence on having everything his own way in the business had hindered him from developing any real activity of his own. Perhaps since her death his father had become less aggressive, although he was still active in the business. Perhaps it was mostly due to an accidental run of good fortune, which was very probable indeed. But at any rate during those 2 years the business had developed in a most unexpected way. The staff had to be doubled, the turnover was 5 times as great, no doubt about it, further progress lay just ahead. But Georg's friend had no inkling of this improvement. In earlier years, perhaps for the last time in that letter of condolence, he had tried to persuade Georg to emigrate to Russia and had enlarged upon the prospects of success for precisely Georg's branch of trade. The figures quoted were microscopic by comparison with the range of Georg's present operations. Yet he shrank from letting his friend know about his business success, and if he were to do it now retrospectively that certainly would look peculiar. So Georg confined himself to giving his friend unimportant items of gossip such as rise at random in the memory when one is idly thinking things over on a quiet Sunday. All he desired was to leave undisturbed the idea of the hometown which his friend must have built up to his own content during the long interval. And so it happened to Georg that 3 times in 3 fairly widely separated letters he had told his friend about the engagement of an unimportant man to an equally unimportant girl, until indeed, quite contrary to his intentions, his friend began to show some interest in this notable event. Yet Georg preferred to write about things like these rather than to confess that he himself had got engaged a month ago to a Fräulein Frieda Brandenfeld, a girl from a well-to-do family. He often discussed this friend of his with his fiancée and the peculiar relationship that had developed between them in their correspondence. "So he won't be coming to our wedding," said she, "and yet I have a right to get to know all your friends." "I don't want to trouble him," answered Georg, "don't misunderstand me. He would probably come, at least I think so, but he would feel that his hand had been forced and he would be hurt. Perhaps he would envy me and certainly he'd be discontented, and without being able to do anything about his discontent he'd have to go away again alone." "Alone? Do you know what that means?" "Yes, but may he not hear about our wedding in some other fashion?" "I can't prevent that, of course, but it's unlikely, considering the way he lives. Since your friends are like that, Georg, you shouldn't ever have got engaged at all." "Well, we're both to blame for that, but I wouldn't have it any other way now." And when, breathing quickly under his kisses, she still brought out, "All the same, I do feel upset," he thought it could not really involve him in trouble were he to send the news to his friend. "That's the kind of man I am and he'll just have to take me as I am," he said to himself. "I can't cut myself to another pattern that might make a more suitable friend for him." And in fact he did inform his friend, in the long letter he had been writing that Sunday morning, about his engagement, with these words: "I have saved my best news to the end. I have got engaged to a Fräulein Frieda Brandenfeld, a girl from a well-to-do family, who only came to live here a long time after you went away, so that you're hardly likely to know her. There will be time to tell you more about her later. For today let me just say that I am very happy, and as between you and me the only difference in our relationship is that instead of a quite ordinary kind of friend you will now have in me a happy friend. Besides that, you will acquire in my fiancée, who sends her warm greetings and will soon write you herself, a genuine friend of the opposite sex, which is not without importance to a bachelor. I know that there are many reasons why you can't come to see us, but would not my wedding be precisely the right occasion for giving all obstacles that go by? Still, however that may be, do just as seems good to you without regarding any interests but your own." With this letter in his hand Georg had been sitting a long time at the writing table, his face turned toward the window. He had barely acknowledged, with an absent smile, a greeting waved to him from the street by a passing acquaintance. At last he put the letter in his pocket and went out of his room across a small lobby into his father's room, which he had not entered for months. There was in fact no need for him to enter it, since he saw his father daily at business and they took their midday meal together at an eating house. In the evening, it was true, each did as he pleased, yet even then, unless Georg, as mostly happened, went out with friends or, more recently, visited his fiancée, they always sat for a while, each with his newspaper, in their common sitting room. It surprised Georg how dark his father's room was even on this sunny morning. So it was overshadowed as much as that by the high wall on the other side of the narrow courtyard. His father was sitting by the window in a corner hung with various mementos of Georg's dead mother, reading a newspaper which he held to one side before his eyes in an attempt to overcome a defect of vision. On the table stood the remains of his breakfast, not much of which seemed to have been eaten. "Ah, Georg," said his father, rising at once to meet him. His heavy dressing gown swung open as he walked and the skirts of it fluttered around him. My father is still a giant of a man, said Georg to himself. It's unbearably dark here, he said aloud. Yes, it's dark enough, answered his father. And you've shut the window, too? I prefer it like that. Well, it's quite warm outside, said Georg, as if continuing his previous remark, and sat down. His father cleared away the breakfast dishes and set them on a chest. I really only wanted to tell you, went on Georg, who had been vacantly following the old man's movements, that I am now sending the news of my engagement to St. Petersburg. He drew the letter a little way from his pocket and let it drop back again. To St. Petersburg? Asked his father. To my friend there, said Georg, trying to meet his father's eye. In business hours he's quite different, he was thinking, how solidly he sits here with his arms crossed. Oh yes. To your friend, said his father, with peculiar emphasis. Well, you know, father, that I wanted not to tell him about my engagement at first. Out of consideration for him, that was the only reason. You know yourself he's a difficult man. I said to myself that someone else might tell him about my engagement, although he's such a solitary creature that was hardly likely. I couldn't prevent that, but I wasn't ever going to tell him myself. And now you've changed your mind? Asked his father, laying his enormous newspaper on the windowsill and on top of it his spectacles, which he covered with one hand. Yes, I've been thinking it over. If he's a good friend of mine, I said to myself, my being happily engaged should make him happy too. And so I wouldn't put off telling him any longer. But before I posted the letter I wanted to let you know. Georg, said his father, lengthening his toothless mouth, listen to me. You've come to me about this business, to talk it over with me. No doubt that does you honor. But it's nothing, it's worse than nothing, if you don't tell me the whole truth. I don't want to stir up matters that shouldn't be mentioned here. Since the death of our dear mother certain things have been done that aren't right. Maybe the time will come for mentioning them, and maybe sooner than we think. There's many a thing in the business I'm not aware of. Maybe it's not done behind my back. I'm not going to say that it's done behind my back. I'm not equal to things any longer. My memory's failing. I haven't an eye for so many things any longer. That's the course of nature in the first place, and in the second place the death of our dear mother hit me harder than it did you. But since we're talking about it, about this letter, I beg you, Georg, don't deceive me. It's a trivial affair, it's hardly worth mentioning, so don't deceive me. Do you really have this friend in St. Petersburg? Georg rose in embarrassment. Never mind my friends. 1,000 friends wouldn't make up to me for my father. Do you know what I think? You're not taking enough care of yourself. But old age must be taken care of. I can't do without you in the business. You know that very well, but if the business is going to undermine your health, I'm ready to close it down tomorrow forever. And that won't do. We'll have to make a change in your way of living. But a radical change. You sit here in the dark, and in the sitting room you would have plenty of light. You just take a bite of breakfast instead of properly keeping up your strength. You sit by a closed window, and the air would be so good for you. No, father, I'll get the doctor to come, and we'll follow his orders. We'll change your room. You can move into the front room and I'll move in here. You won't notice the change, all your things will be moved with you. But there's time for all that later. I'll put you to bed now for a little, I'm sure you need to rest. Come, I'll help you to take off your things, you'll see I can do it. Or if you would rather go into the front room at once, you can lie down in my bed for the present. That would be the most sensible thing. Georg stood close beside his father, who had let his head with its unkempt white hair sink on his chest. Georg, said his father in a low voice, without moving. Georg knelt down at once beside his father. In the old man's weary face he saw the pupils, overlarge, fixedly looking at him from the corners of the eyes. You have no friend in St. Petersburg. You've always been a leg puller and you haven't even shrunk from pulling my leg. How could you have a friend out there? I can't believe it. Just think back a bit, father, said Georg, lifting his father from the chair and slipping off his dressing gown as he stood feebly enough. It'll soon be 3 years since my friend came to see us last. I remember that you used not to like him very much. At least twice I kept you from seeing him, although he was actually sitting with me in my room. I could quite well understand your dislike of him. My friend has his peculiarities. But then, later, you got on with him very well. I was proud because you listened to him and nodded and asked him questions. If you think back you're bound to remember. He used to tell us the most incredible stories of the Russian Revolution. For instance, when he was on a business trip to Kiev and ran into a riot, and saw a priest on a balcony who cut a broad cross in blood on the palm of his hand and held the hand up and appealed to the mob. You've told that story yourself once or twice since. Meanwhile Georg had succeeded in lowering his father down again and carefully taking off the woolen drawers he wore over his linen underpants and his socks. The not particularly clean appearance of his underwear made him reproach himself for having been neglectful. It should have certainly been his duty to see that his father had clean changes of underwear. He had not yet explicitly discussed with his bride to be what arrangements should be made for his father in the future, for they had both of them silently taken it for granted that the old man would go on living alone in the old house. But now he made a quick, firm decision to take him into his own future establishment. It almost looked, on closer inspection, as if the care he meant to lavish there on his father might come too late. He carried his father to bed in his arms. It gave him a dreadful feeling to notice that while he took the few steps toward the bed, the old man on his breast was playing with his watch chain. He could not lay him down on the bed for a moment, so firmly did he hang on to the watch chain. But as soon as he was laid in bed, all seemed well. He covered himself up and even drew the blankets farther than usual over his shoulders. He looked up at Georg with a not unfriendly eye. "You begin to remember my friend, don't you?" asked Georg, giving him an encouraging nod. "Am I well covered up now?" asked his father, as if he were not able to see whether his feet were properly tucked in or not. "So you find it snug in bed already," said Georg, and tucked the blankets more closely around him. "Am I well covered up?" asked the father once more, seeming to be strangely intent upon the answer. "Don't worry, you're well covered up." "No," cried his father, cutting short the answer, threw the blankets off with a strength that sent them all flying in a moment and sprang erect in bed. Only one hand lightly touched the ceiling to steady him. "You wanted to cover me up, I know, my young sprig, but I'm far from being covered up yet. And even if this is the last strength I have, it's enough for you, too much for you. Of course I know your friend. He would have been a son after my own heart. That's why you've been playing him false all these years. Why else? Do you think I haven't been sorry for him? And that's why you had to lock yourself up in your office. The chief is busy, mustn't be disturbed, just so that you could write your lying little letters to Russia. But thank goodness a father doesn't need to be taught how to see through his son. And now that you thought you'd got him down, so far down that you could set your bottom on him and sit on him and he wouldn't move, then my fine son makes up his mind to get married." Georg stared at the bogey conjured up by his father. His friend in St. Petersburg, whom his father suddenly knew too well, touched his imagination as never before. Lost in the vastness of Russia he saw him. At the door of an empty, plundered warehouse he saw him. Among the wreckage of his showcases, the slashed remnants of his wares, the falling gas brackets, he was just standing up. Why did he have to go so far away? "But attend to me," cried his father, and Georg, almost distracted, ran toward the bed to take everything in, yet came to a stop halfway. "Because she lifted up her skirts," his father began to flute, "because she lifted her skirts like this, the nasty creature." And mimicking her he lifted his shirt so high that one could see the scar on his thigh from his war wound. "Because she lifted her skirts like this, and this you made up to her, and in order to make free with her undisturbed you have disgraced your mother's memory, betrayed your friend, and stuck your father into bed so that he can't move. But he can move, or can't he?" And he stood up quite unsupported and kicked his legs out. His insight made him radiant. Georg shrank into a corner, as far away from his father as possible. A long time ago he had firmly made up his mind to watch closely every least movement so that he should not be surprised by any indirect attack, a pounce from behind or above. At this moment he recalled this long-forgotten resolve and forgot it again, like a man drawing a short thread through the eye of a needle. "But your friend hasn't been betrayed after all," cried his father, emphasizing the point with stabs of his forefinger. "I've been representing him here on the spot. You comedian." Georg could not resist the retort, realized at once the harm done and, his eyes starting in his head, bit his tongue back, only too late, till the pain made his knees give. "Yes, of course I've been playing a comedy." "A comedy? That's a good expression. What other comfort was left to a poor old widower? Tell me, and while you're answering me, be you still my living son, what else was left to me, in my back room, plagued by a disloyal staff, old to the marrow of my bones? And my son strutting through the world, finishing off deals that I had prepared for him, bursting with triumphant glee, and stalking away from his father with the closed face of a respectable businessman. Do you think I didn't love you, I, from whom you were sprung?" Now he'll lean forward, thought Georg. What if he topples and smashes himself? These words went hissing through his mind. His father leaned forward but did not topple. Since Georg did not come any nearer, as he had expected, he straightened himself again. "Stay where you are, I don't need you. You think you have strength enough to come over here and that you're only hanging back of your own accord. Don't be too sure. I am still much the stronger of us two. All by myself I might have had to give way, but your mother has given me so much of her strength that I've established a fine connection with your friend and I have your customers here in my pocket." "He has pockets even in his shirt," said Georg to himself, and believed that with this remark he could make him an impossible figure for all the world. Only for a moment did he think so, since he kept on forgetting everything. "Just take your bride on your arm and try getting in my way. I'll sweep her from your very side, you don't know how." Georg made a grimace of disbelief. His father only nodded, confirming the truth of his words, toward Georg's corner. "How you amused me today, coming to ask me if you should tell your friend about your engagement. He knows it already, you stupid boy, he knows it all. I've been writing to him, for you forgot to take my writing things away from me. That's why he hasn't been here for years. He knows everything 100 times better than you do yourself. In his left hand he crumples your letters unopened while in his right hand he holds up my letters to read through. In his enthusiasm he waved his arm over his head. He knows everything 1,000 times better, he cried. 10,000 times, said Georg, to make fun of his father, but in his very mouth the words turned into deadly earnest. For years I've been waiting for you to come with some such question. Do you think I concern myself with anything else? Do you think I read my newspapers? Look, and he threw Georg a newspaper sheet which he had somehow taken to bed with him. An old newspaper, with a name entirely unknown to Georg. How long a time you've taken to grow up. Your mother had to die, she couldn't see the happy day, your friend is going to pieces in Russia, even 3 years ago he was yellow enough to be thrown away, and as for me, you see what condition I'm in. You have eyes in your head for that. So you've been lying in wait for me, cried Georg. His father said pityingly, in an offhand manner, I suppose you wanted to say that sooner. But now it doesn't matter. And in a louder voice. So now you know what else there was in the world besides yourself, till now you've known only about yourself. An innocent child, yes, that you were, truly, but still more truly have you been a devilish human being. And therefore take note. I sentence you now to death by drowning. Georg felt himself urged from the room. The crash with which his father fell on the bed behind him was still in his ears as he fled. On the staircase, which he rushed down as if its steps were an inclined plane, he ran into his charwoman on her way up to do the morning cleaning of the room. Jesus! She cried, and covered her face with her apron, but he was already gone. Out of the front door he rushed, across the roadway, driven toward the water. Already he was grasping at the railings as a starving man clutches food. He swung himself over, like the distinguished gymnast he had once been in his youth, to his parents' pride. With weakening grip he was still holding on when he spied between the railings a motor bus coming which would easily cover the noise of his fall, called in a low voice. Dear parents, I have always loved you, all the same, and let himself drop. At this moment an unending stream of traffic was just going over the bridge. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. The Metamorphosis. As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. He was lying on his hard, as it were armor-plated, back, and when he lifted his head a little he could see his dome-like brown belly divided into stiff arched segments on top of which the bedquilt could hardly keep in position and was about to slide off completely. His numerous legs, which were pitifully thin compared to the rest of his bulk, waved helplessly before his eyes. What has happened to me? He thought. It was no dream. His room, a regular human bedroom, only rather too small, lay quiet between the four familiar walls. Above the table on which a collection of cloth samples was unpacked and spread out, Samsa was a commercial traveler, hung the picture which he had recently cut out of an illustrated magazine and put into a pre-gilt frame. It showed a lady, with a fur cap on and a fur stole, sitting upright and holding out to the spectator a huge fur muff into which the whole of her forearm had vanished. Gregor's eyes turned next to the window, and the overcast sky, one could hear raindrops beating on the window gutter, made him quite melancholy. What about sleeping a little longer and forgetting all this nonsense, he thought, but it could not be done, for he was accustomed to sleep on his right side and in his present condition he could not turn himself over. However violently he forced himself toward his right side he always rolled onto his back again. He tried it at least 100 times, shutting his eyes to keep from seeing his struggling legs, and only desisted when he began to feel in his side a faint dull ache he had never experienced before. Oh God, he thought, what an exhausting job I've picked on. Traveling about day in, day out. It's much more irritating work than doing the actual business in the office, and on top of that there's the trouble of constant traveling, of worrying about train connections, the bed and irregular meals, casual acquaintances that are always new and never become intimate friends. The devil take it all. He felt a slight itching up on his belly, slowly pushed himself on his back nearer to the top of the bed so that he could lift his head more easily, identified the itching place which was surrounded by many small white spots the nature of which he could not understand and made to touch it with a leg, but drew the leg back immediately, for the contact made a cold shiver run through him. He slid down again into his former position. This getting up early, he thought, makes one quite stupid. A man needs his sleep. Other commercials live like harem women. For instance, when I come back to the hotel of a morning to write up the orders I've got, these others are only sitting down to the breakfast. Let me just try that with my chief, I'd be sacked on the spot. Anyhow, that might be quite a good thing for me, who can tell? If I didn't have to hold my hand because of my parents I'd have given notice long ago, I'd have gone to the chief and told him exactly what I think of him. That would knock him endways from his desk. It's a queer way of doing, too, this sitting on high at a desk and talking down to employees, especially when they have to come quite near because the chief is hard of hearing. Well, there's still hope. Once I've saved enough money to pay back my parents' debts to him. That should take another 5 or 6 years, I'll do it without fail. I'll cut myself completely loose then. For the moment, though, I'd better get up, since my train goes at 5. He looked at the alarm clock ticking on the chest. Heavenly Father, he thought. It was 6:30 o'clock and the hands were quietly moving on. It was even past the half hour, it was getting on toward 6:45. Had the alarm clock not gone off? From the bed one could see that it had been properly set for 4 o'clock, of course it must have gone off. Yes, but was it possible to sleep quietly through that ear-splitting noise? Well, he had not slept quietly, yet apparently all the more soundly for that. But what was he to do now? The next train went at 7 o'clock. To catch that he would need to hurry like mad and his samples weren't even packed up, and he himself wasn't feeling particularly fresh and active. And even if he did catch the train, he wouldn't avoid a row with the chief, since the firm's porter would have been waiting for the 5 o'clock train and would have long since reported his failure to turn up. The porter was a creature of the chief's, spineless and stupid. Well, supposing he were to say he was sick? But that would be most unpleasant and would look suspicious, since during his 5 years' employment he had not been ill once. The chief himself would be sure to come with the sick insurance doctor, would reproach his parents with their son's laziness, and would cut all excuses short by referring to the insurance doctor, who of course regarded all mankind as perfectly healthy malingerers. And would he be so far wrong on this occasion? Gregor really felt quite well, apart from a drowsiness that was utterly superfluous after such a long sleep, and he was even unusually hungry. As all this was running through his mind at top speed without his being able to decide to leave his bed, the alarm clock had just struck 7:15. There came a cautious tap at the door behind the head of his bed. "Gregor," said a voice. It was his mother's. "It's 7:15. Hadn't you a train to catch?" That gentle voice. Gregor had a shock as he heard his own voice answering hers, unmistakably his own voice, it was true, but with a persistent horrible twittering squeak behind it like an undertone, which left the words in their clear shape only for the first moment and then rose up reverberating around them to destroy their sense, so that one could not be sure one had heard them rightly. Gregor wanted to answer at length and explain everything, but in the circumstances he confined himself to saying, "Yes, yes, thank you, mother, I'm getting up now." The wooden door between them must have kept the change in his voice from being noticeable outside, for his mother contented herself with this statement and shuffled away. Yet this brief exchange of words had made the other members of the family aware that Gregor was still in the house, as they had not expected, and at one of the side doors his father was already knocking, gently, yet with his fist. "Gregor, Gregor," he called, "what's the matter with you?" And after a little while he called again in a deeper voice, "Gregor. Gregor." At the other side door his sister was saying in a low, plaintive tone, "Gregor? Aren't you well? Are you needing anything?" He answered them both at once, "I'm just ready," and did his best to make his voice sound as normal as possible by enunciating the words very clearly and leaving long pauses between them. So his father went back to his breakfast, but his sister whispered, "Gregor, open the door, do." However, he was not thinking of opening the door, and felt thankful for the prudent habit he had acquired in traveling of locking all doors during the night, even at home. His immediate intention was to get up quietly without being disturbed, to put on his clothes and above all eat his breakfast, and only then consider what else was to be done, since in bed, he was well aware, his meditations would come to no sensible conclusion. He remembered that often enough in bed he had felt small aches and pains, probably caused by awkward postures, which had proved purely imaginary once he got up, and he looked forward eagerly to seeing this morning's delusions gradually fall away. That the change in his voice was nothing but the precursor of a severe chill, a standing ailment of commercial travelers, he had not the least possible doubt. To get rid of the quilt was quite easy, he had only to inflate himself a little and it fell off by itself. But the next move was difficult, especially because he was so uncommonly broad. He would have needed arms and hands to hoist himself up, instead he had only the numerous little legs which never stopped waving in all directions and which he could not control in the least. When he tried to bend one of them it was the first to stretch itself straight, and did he succeed at last in making it do what he wanted, all the other legs meanwhile waved the more wildly in a high degree of unpleasant agitation. "But what's the use of lying idle in bed," said Gregor to himself. He thought that he might get out of bed with the lower part of his body first, but this lower part, which he had not yet seen and of which he could form no clear conception, proved too difficult to move. It shifted so slowly, and when finally, almost wild with annoyance, he gathered his forces together and thrust out recklessly, he had miscalculated the direction and bumped heavily against the lower end of the bed, and the stinging pain he felt informed him that precisely this lower part of his body was at the moment probably the most sensitive. So he tried to get the top part of himself out first, and cautiously moved his head toward the edge of the bed. That proved easy enough, and despite its breadth and mass the bulk of his body at last slowly followed the movement of his head. Still, when he finally got his head free over the edge of the bed he felt too scared to go on advancing, for after all if he let himself fall in this way it would take a miracle to keep his head from being injured. And at all costs he must not lose consciousness now, precisely now, he would rather stay in bed. But when after a repetition of the same efforts he lay in his former position again, sighing, and watched his little legs struggling against each other more wildly than ever, if that were possible, and saw no way of bringing any order into this arbitrary confusion, he told himself again that it was impossible to stay in bed and that the most sensible course was to risk everything for the smallest hope of getting away from it. At the same time he did not forget to remind himself occasionally that cool reflection, the coolest possible, was much better than desperate resolves. In such moments he focused his eyes as sharply as possible on the window, but, unfortunately, the prospect of the morning fog, which muffled even the other side of the narrow street, brought him little encouragement and comfort. 7 o'clock already, he said to himself when the alarm clock chimed again, 7 o'clock already and still such a thick fog. And for a little while he lay quiet, breathing lightly, as if perhaps expecting such complete repose to restore all things to their real and normal condition. But then he said to himself, before it strikes 7:15 I must be quite out of this bed, without fail. Anyhow, By that time someone will have come from the office to ask for me, since it opens before 7. And he set himself to rocking his whole body at once in a regular rhythm, with the idea of swinging it out of the bed. If he tipped himself out in that way he could keep his head from injury by lifting it at an acute angle when he fell. His back seemed to be hard and was not likely to suffer from a fall on the carpet. His biggest worry was the loud crash he would not be able to help making, which would probably cause anxiety, if not terror, behind all the doors. Still, he must take the risk. When he was already half out of the bed, the new method was more game than an effort, for he needed only to hitch himself across by rocking to and fro. It struck him how simple it would be if he could get help. 2 strong people, he thought of his father and the servant girl, would be amply sufficient. They would only have to thrust their arms under his convex back, lever him out of the bed, bend down with their burden, and then be patient enough to let him turn himself right over onto the floor, where it was to be hoped his legs would then find their proper function. Well, ignoring the fact that the doors were all locked, ought he really to call for help? In spite of his misery he could not suppress a smile at the very idea of it. He had got so far that he could barely keep his equilibrium when he rocked himself strongly, and he would have to nerve himself very soon for the final decision since in 5 minutes' time it would be 7:15, when the front doorbell rang. That's someone from the office, he said to himself, and grew almost rigid, while his little legs only jigged about all the faster. For a moment everything stayed quiet. They're not going to open the door, said Gregor to himself, catching at some kind of irrational hope. But then of course the servant girl went as usual to the door with her heavy tread and opened it. Gregor needed only to hear the first good morning of the visitor to know immediately who it was, the chief clerk himself. What a fate, to be condemned to work for a firm where the smallest omission at once gave rise to the gravest suspicion. Were all employees in a body nothing but scoundrels, was there not among them one single loyal devoted man who, had he wasted only an hour or so of the firm's time in a morning, was so tormented by conscience as to be driven out of his mind and actually incapable of leaving his bed? Wouldn't it really have been sufficient to send an apprentice to inquire, if any inquiry were necessary at all? Did the chief clerk himself have to come and thus indicate to the entire family, an innocent family, that this suspicious circumstance could be investigated by no one less versed in affairs than himself? And more through the agitation caused by these reflections than through any act of will, Gregor swung himself out of bed with all his strength. There was a loud thump, but it was not really a crash. His fall was broken to some extent by the carpet. His back, too, was less stiff than he thought, and so there was merely a dull thud, not so very startling. Only he had not lifted his head carefully enough and had hit it. He turned it and rubbed it on the carpet in pain and irritation. That was something falling down in there, said the chief clerk in the next room to the left. Gregor tried to suppose to himself that something like what had happened to him today might someday happen to the chief clerk. One really could not deny that it was possible. But as if in brusque reply to this supposition the chief clerk took a couple of firm steps in the next doorroom and his patent leather boots creaked. From the right-hand room his sister was whispering to inform him of the situation. "Gregor, the chief clerk's here." "I know," muttered Gregor to himself, but he didn't dare to make his voice loud enough for his sister to hear it. "Gregor," said his father now from the left-hand room, "the chief clerk has come and wants to know why you didn't catch the early train. We don't know what to say to him. Besides, he wants to talk to you in person. So open the door, please. He will be good enough to excuse the untidiness of your room." "Good morning, Mr. Samsa," the chief clerk was calling amiably meanwhile. "He's not well," said his mother to the visitor, while his father was still speaking through the door. "He's not well, sir, believe me. What else would make him miss a train? The boy thinks about nothing but his work. It makes me almost cross the way he never goes out in the evenings. He's been here the last 8 days and has stayed at home every single evening. He just sits there quietly at the table reading a newspaper or looking through railway timetables. The only amusement he gets is doing fretwork. For instance, he spent 2 or 3 evenings cutting out a little picture frame. You would be surprised to see how pretty it is. It's hanging in his room. You'll see it in a minute when Gregor opens the door. I must say I'm glad you've come, sir. We should never have got him to unlock the door by ourselves. He's so obstinate, and I'm sure he's unwell, though he wouldn't have it to be so this morning." "I'm just coming," said Gregor slowly and carefully, not moving an inch for fear of losing one word of the conversation. "I can't think of any other explanation, madam," said the chief clerk. "I hope it's nothing serious. Although on the other hand I must say that we men of business, fortunately or unfortunately, very often simply have to ignore any slight indisposition, since business must be attended to." "Well, can the chief clerk come in now?" asked Gregor's father impatiently, again knocking on the door. "No," said Gregor. In the left-hand room a painful silence followed this refusal. In the right-hand room his sister began to sob. Why didn't his sister join the others? She was probably newly out of bed and hadn't even begun to put on her clothes yet. Well, why was she crying? Because he wouldn't get up and let the chief clerk in, because he was in danger of losing his job, and because the chief would begin dunning his parents again for the old debts? Surely these were things one didn't need to worry about for the present. Gregor was still at home and not in the least thinking of deserting the family. At the moment, true, he was lying on the carpet and no one who knew the condition he was in could seriously expect him to admit the chief clerk. But for such a small discourtesy, which could plausibly be explained away somehow later on, Gregor could hardly be dismissed on the spot. And it seemed to Gregor that it would be much more sensible to leave him in peace for the present than to trouble him with tears and entreaties. Still, of course, their uncertainty bewildered them all and excused their behavior. "Mr. Samsa," the chief clerk called now in a louder voice, "what's the matter with you? Here you are, barricading yourself in your room, giving only yes and no for answers, causing your parents a lot of unnecessary trouble and neglecting. I mention this only in passing, neglecting your business duties in an incredible fashion. I am speaking here in the name of your parents and of your chief, and I beg you quite seriously to give me an immediate and precise explanation. You amaze me, you amaze me. I thought you were a quiet, dependable person, and now all at once you seem bent on making a disgraceful exhibition of yourself. The chief did hint to me early this morning a possible explanation for your disappearance, with reference to the cash payments that were entrusted to you recently, but I almost pledged my solemn word of honor that this could not be so. But now that I see how incredibly obstinate you are, I no longer have the slightest desire to take your part at all. And your position in the firm is not so unassailable. I came with the intention of telling you all this in private, but since you are wasting my time so needlessly, I don't see why your parents shouldn't hear it too. For some time past your work has been most unsatisfactory. This is not the season of the year for a business boom, of course, we admit that, but a season of the year for doing no business at all, that does not exist, Mr. Samsa, must not exist. But, sir, cried Gregor, beside himself and in his agitation forgetting everything else, I'm just going to open the door this very minute. A slight illness, an attack of giddiness, has kept me from getting up. I'm still lying in bed. But I feel all right again. I'm getting out of bed now. Just give me a moment or two longer. I'm not quite so well as I thought. But I'm all right, really. How a thing like that can suddenly strike one down. Only last night I was quite well, my parents can tell you, or rather I did have a slight presentiment. I must have showed some sign of it. Why didn't I report it at the office? But one always thinks that an indisposition can be got over without staying in the house. Oh sir, do spare my parents. All that you're reproaching me with now has no foundation. No one has ever said a word to me about it. Perhaps you haven't looked at the last orders I sent in. Anyhow, I can still catch the 8 o'clock train. I'm much the better for my few hours rest. Don't let me detain you here, sir. I'll be attending to business very soon, and do be good enough to tell the chief so and to make my excuses to him. And while all this was tumbling out pell-mell and Gregor hardly knew what he was saying, he had reached the chest quite easily, perhaps because of the practice he had had in bed, and was now trying to lever himself upright by means of it. He meant actually to open the door, actually to show himself and speak to the chief clerk. He was eager to find out what the others, after all their insistence, would say at the sight of him. If they were horrified, then the responsibility was no longer his and he could stay quiet. But if they took it calmly, then he had no reason either to be upset, and could really get to the station for the 8 o'clock train if he hurried. At first he slipped down a few times from the polished surface of the chest, but at length with a last heave he stood upright. He paid no more attention to the pains in the lower part of his body, however they smarted. Then he let himself fall against the back of a nearby chair, and clung with his little legs to the edges of it. That brought him into control of himself again and he stopped speaking, for now he could listen to what the chief clerk was saying. Did you understand a word of it? The chief clerk was asking. Surely he can't be trying to make fools of us? Oh dear, cried his mother, in tears, perhaps he's terribly ill and we're tormenting him. Greta, Greta, she called out then. Yes, mother? Called his sister from the other side. They were calling to each other across Gregor's room. You must go this minute for the doctor. Gregor is ill. Go for the doctor, quick. Did you hear how he was speaking? That was no human voice, said the chief clerk in a voice noticeably low beside the shrillness of the mother's. Anna, Anna. His father was calling through the hall to the kitchen, clapping his hands, get a locksmith at once. And the two girls were already running through the hall with a swish of skirts. How could his sister have got dressed so quickly? And were tearing the front door open. There was no sound of its closing again. They had evidently left it open, as one does in houses where some great misfortune has happened. But Gregor was now much calmer. The words he uttered were no longer understandable, apparently, although they seemed clear enough to him, even clearer than before, perhaps because his ear had grown accustomed to the sound of them. Yet at any rate people now believed that something was wrong with him, and were ready to help him. The positive certainty with which these first measures had been taken comforted him. He felt himself drawn once more into the human circle and hoped for great and remarkable results from both the doctor and the locksmith, without really distinguishing precisely between them. To make his voice as clear as possible for the decisive conversation that was now imminent, he coughed a little, as quietly as he could, of course, since this noise too might not sound like a human cough for all he was able to judge. In the next room meanwhile there was complete silence. Perhaps his parents were sitting at the table with the chief clerk, whispering, perhaps they were all leaning against the door and listening. Slowly Gregor pushed the chair toward the door, then let go of it, caught hold of the door for support. The soles at the end of his little legs were somewhat sticky, and rested against it for a moment after his efforts. Then he set himself to turning the key in the lock with his mouth. It seemed, unhappily, that he hadn't really any teeth. What could he grip the key with? But on the other hand, his jaws were certainly very strong. With their help he did manage to set the key in motion, heedless of the fact that he was undoubtedly damaging them somewhere, since a brown fluid issued from his mouth, flowed over the key, and dripped on the floor. "Just listen to that," said the chief clerk next door, "he's turning the key." That was a great encouragement to Gregor, but they should all have shouted encouragement to him, his father and mother too. "Go on, Gregor," they should have called out, "keep going, hold on to that key." And in the belief that they were all following his efforts intently, he clenched his jaws recklessly on the key with all the force at his command. As the turning of the key progressed, he circled around the lock, holding on now only with his mouth, pushing on the key, as required, or pulling it down again with all the weight of his body. The louder click of the finally yielding lock literally quickened Gregor. With a deep breath of relief, he said to himself, "So I didn't need the locksmith," and laid his head on the handle to open the door wide. Since he had to pull the door toward him, he was still invisible when it was really wide open. He had to edge himself slowly around the near half of the double door, and to do it very carefully if he was not to fall plump upon his back just on the threshold. He was still carrying out this difficult maneuver, with no time to observe anything else, when he heard the chief clerk utter aloud, "Oh!" It sounded like a gust of wind. And now he could see the man, standing as he was nearest to the door, clapping one hand before his open mouth and slowly backing away as if driven by some invisible steady pressure. His mother, in spite of the chief clerk's being there, her hair was still undone and sticking up in all directions, first clasped her hands and looked at his father, then took 2 steps toward Gregor and fell on the floor among her outspread skirts, her face quite hidden on her breast. His father nodded his fist with a fierce expression on his face as if he meant to knock Gregor back into his room, then looked uncertainly around the living room, covered his eyes with his hands, and wept till his great chest heaved. Gregor did not go now into the living room, but leaned against the inside of the firmly shut wing of the door, so that only half his body was visible and his head above it bending sideways to look at the others. The light had meanwhile strengthened. On the other side of the street one could see clearly a section of the endlessly long, dark gray building opposite. It was a hospital, abruptly punctuated by its row of regular windows. The rain was still falling, but only in large singly discernible and literally singly splashing drops. The breakfast dishes were set out on the table lavishly, for breakfast was the most important meal of the day to Gregor's father, who lingered it out for hours over various newspapers. Right opposite Gregor on the wall hung a photograph of himself in military service, as a lieutenant, hand on sword, a carefree smile on his face, inviting one to respect his uniform and military bearing. The door leading to the hall was open, and one could see that the front door stood open too, showing the landing beyond and the beginning of the stairs going down. "Well," said Gregor, knowing perfectly that he was the only one who had retained any composure, "I'll put my clothes on at once, pack up my samples, and start off. Will you only let me go? You see, sir, I'm not obstinate, and I'm willing to work. Traveling is a hard life, but I couldn't live without it." "Where are you going, sir? To the office?" "Yes." "Will you give a true account of all this?" One can be temporarily incapacitated, but that's just the moment for remembering former services and bearing in mind that later on, when the incapacity has been got over, one will certainly work with all the more industry and concentration. "I'm loyally bound to serve the chief, you know that very well. Besides, I have to provide for my parents and my sister. I'm in great difficulties, but I'll get out of them again. Don't make things any worse for me than they are. Stand up for me in the firm. Travelers are not popular there, I know. People think they earn sacks of money and just have a good time. A prejudice there's no particular reason for revising. But you, sir, have a more comprehensive view of affairs than the rest of the staff. Yes, let me tell you in confidence, a more comprehensive view than the chief himself, who, being the owner, lets his judgment easily be swayed against one of his employees. And you know very well that the traveler, who is never seen in the office almost the whole year around,